Hello everybody, welcome to number 27. I'm Jack and today I am here with a Lotus Esprit V8. There's something really interesting about these cars. They could have potentially been the biggest success story, the most legendary car of the 1990s. As it is still an excellent car, but there is an issue with it that has prevented it from potentially rewriting Lotus history. Let's take it for a drive and I'll tell you all about it. Now, I've had an Esprit before. I had an absolutely gorgeous S3 Turbo. It was a 1984 car. I absolutely loved that thing. It was one of those cars that you get and then you think it's going to be a whole load of trouble. Everyone said, don't go near it, you're mad, it's going to be never ending. All that it had in 1 year, being kept outside, cold, rain, everything, the only thing that went wrong was the coil, which you can't blame the car for. So I have a real soft spot for Esprits. That early thing was quite an agricultural car, really, compared to this later one. But those first designs, which were the Giugiaro design, the sharp lines, they were incredible looking things. And in 1987, I think, Peter Stevens had the unenviable task of updating it for the new car, for the S4. Actually, he did a really good job. This particular car, the V8, is a 1997 and it has further design tweaks from Peter Thompson. No, not Peter Thompson, I'm getting confused with Peter Stevens. Julian Thompson, who did the Elise, and he sort of did a little bit more of a makeover. It hasn't changed drastically at that point. In the finest tradition of sharing parts, this has quite a few parts bin sort of special bits, but most notable are those rear lights which come from a Toyota Corolla. The thing is, massive tractor, the thing is that they actually suit this car perfectly. They look even better than they did, they look miles better than they did on the Corolla. So it's hardly, it's hardly an issue. There's also these switches which come from Peugeot, from the 205, I think, perhaps even earlier than that. But again, they work pretty well. They're there in my Elise, they look okay. So not a big issue, I don't think. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is that I think that this was a pretty successful redesign. I think it looks absolutely fantastic. This particular car, before we go into any more detail about the big problem that I wanted to talk to you about, the big missed opportunity by Lotus, you just have to know they have a really bad rep, these as well, the V8s, or they used to certainly. And unfortunately, Sasha, who bought this, did rather go through the mill. He bought what he thought was a good car that had already been rebuilt because the original ones had issues with the liners coming unstuck. So Lotus rebuilt most of them in warranty. But when the local dealer rebuilt this engine, they used rather too much silicone in the sump. That silicone got loose, blocked up some of the galleries. So Sasha had it a couple of weeks. He went to do a track day on it. Absolutely loved the handling. Thought it was a fantastic thing, was really enjoying it, and then round one corner, it simply stopped. He didn't think that much of it, but then it wouldn't start again. When he got it home, tried to move the crank, it was seized solid. So what happened is some of that silicone had come off, it had blocked the galleries for pistons, I think 2 and 3, and eventually the crank seized. So he had a really big horror story with this, because he ended up having to pay in the end, I think 15 or 20,000 to have it rebuilt. Some of the bits weren't available anymore, like the crank, so you had to have that made out of billet. So it's a bit of a horror story, but it ends well because he has now had it for a while, he's used it, he absolutely adores it. So really incredibly, when Lotus developed this car, they decided that previously the Esprit could match the other little junior supercars in terms of looks and certainly in terms of handling, but the 4-cylinder turbo engine was never really in the same league as the V8s and V6s that the other cars had. So Lotus were determined to go all the way and get a proper engine for the Esprit. They decided to design their own V8, not to just get one off the shelf, which was a pretty incredible decision. That cost them £5.5 million. Now you've got to think that the whole development of the Lotus Elise only cost Lotus $4 million, to see what an incredibly important and expensive decision it was. And overall, I think it didn't quite serve them that well. Certainly commercially it didn't. Would have definitely been better for them to buy an off-the-shelf engine. But it's to our gain that they didn't. So I mentioned in the introduction that this could have become one of the all-time legendary cars, possibly one of the most legendary of the 90s. That is because when Lotus designed this engine, it was designed really to put out, it's got twin turbos, 90-degree angle, flat plane crank, and it can comfortably put out 500 horsepower. But Lotus decided to stick with the Renault gearbox, and that was limited in power for power and torque to 350 horsepower. So although they had this engine that was capable of completely trashing the competition, but they decided to stick with that gearbox. That doesn't mean that it's a bad car, and in many ways it still outperformed everything else. It's quicker than a 355. I would say it outhandles a 355. And it was still cheaper. But it was just a missed opportunity, because you can imagine 350 is not bad, to be honest with you, but you can imagine what they could have done if they had gone with a full 500 horsepower. It could have really redefined Lotus. So this is still a very rapid thing. 0 to 60, 4.6 seconds, 175, I think, miles an hour top speed. And crucially, it handles absolutely beautifully. I went out with the owner earlier to try and just get a bit more of a feel for it for when I actually went out with it, and I'm getting more and more comfortable with it, and it is like a big puppy. It really encourages you to push it, and you get so much feedback, not just from the front but from the back of the car as well, that even on these roads, which aren't ideal for a junior supercar, it inspires so much confidence. The steering is perfectly judged. Now on a 355 the steering is definitely much quicker, and that can be fun, but I think that for overall performance and for longevity, for sort of depth of handling, this is just better. It doesn't need to be quite as quick as it is on a 355. This also has more feel. It's just so nicely balanced around the corners. It is an absolute delight. The suspension works really, really well. What a really impressive car. There are a couple of issues, I would say, with this V8. The first is still that it does have that Renault gearbox, and although it's not as bad as I think people have made out, it just takes some getting used to. So you need to know where the gears are, and even then it is a little bit obstructive, but it's not bad. Engaging the gears is quite positive, so it's something I can live with. The driving position is great, really exactly what you'd want. There is limited space here, but there is more space than in the earlier Esprits, so I fit in it pretty comfortably. And with the new dash that this facelifted V8 version had, it's a much easier car to live in. It feels airy. Visibility isn't great, especially from the back. I can kind of see that big spoiler. That's about it. But it is all about, oh, the handling is just great. It feels like a big, mild-mannered Elise. It is fantastic. And it is fast. Sort of seems to top out around 6.8, something like that. Now, the engine isn't the most characterful thing, which I think is where I come back to one of the faults. There's plenty of pull. It's quite linear, so it will keep pulling right to the top to sort of almost 7,000. So it's a nice engine to use, but it doesn't sound special, and it feels a little bit rough up at the top end. Not enough to stop you revving it, but certainly it's not a particularly charismatic lump. So the engine is quite compact and quite light, so overall it only weighs 1,400 kilos, which is 100 kilos less than a 355. And I think allied with the fact that the performance, the power, and the turbo urge really make it feel like a significantly quicker car. I mentioned earlier that the interior on this has been updated, and it does make quite a big difference. Also, Sasha, who owns this car, he's basically done he's converted the stereo slot to have some extra gauges, and after his engine went, he wanted to make sure he could tell exactly what was going on, and it looks really OEM. It looks fantastic. Boost gauge, the whole lot. So to sum up, I think Sasha and his wife have been really unlucky with what happened with the car. They ended up rebuilding it themselves. Because they didn't have the cash, they got the engine rebuilt, but then they had to put the car back together themselves. So it was a bonding session, but it cost them a lot of money, which is not so good. But you can't blame the Esprit for that. It really isn't the fault of this car. Let's do a little bit of a pull now we're getting to the main road. It is extremely rapid, let me tell you. I don't think it's missing that much on the 350 horsepower compared to what it could have been, the 500 or whatever. It's just obviously in terms of legacy, it has missed out. But as a car, it's absolutely fantastic. In most ways, it has a bit more depth to me than a 355. A 355 is very shouty, and it is incredible when you first get in it. It overwhelms the sensors. The steering is so quick, so accurate. The engine sounds like a machine gun going off. But I think longer term, the balance, the way the chassis on this is set up, probably it has a bit more longevity in it, I think, as a car. In any case, I absolutely love it. It is yet another Lotus that I think is just, I don't know, they're just brilliant cars. And this is quite nice. I mean, it's nicely trimmed. Thank you all so much for having watched. Please do subscribe if you haven't, because it really helps. If you've got an interesting car that you want me to review, then please get in touch with me. Instagram is the best way. I really look forward to seeing you for the next video.